We're going to close this out with a real treat. As I said before, the vision behind this summit is to bring the very best of what we have to offer in the defense industry from Indiana together with policymakers, economic development, and local leadership from our region, and then invite important people from throughout the country involved in venture capital and innovation and show off the very best of what we have to offer in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I think we've done that with our next speaker. In years past, we've heard from other important innovators and disruptors like Palmer Luckey, who came back year after year and even made investments in the state of Indiana because of his relationship and ties that came about from our first summit 3 years ago. But I hope that that would be the story for many years to come from this summit and future summits as well. So with that, it's great to welcome my friend Joe Lonsdale, who is one of the key figures in venture capital and national defense in the United States of America, a co-founder of a small company called Palantir, doing really important things. We'll ask him in a minute to explain what Palantir does, but a key venture capital figure who came all the way to Fort Wayne, Indiana. Please give him a warm Hoosier welcome for making the trip. Joe, welcome. I hope you're enjoying Fort Wayne so far. It's a great community. This is my home community. We're known for our manufacturing base. My dad is a retired factory worker, made axles all of his life. We have the most manufacturing jobs per capita of anywhere in the country, the crossroads of America. We already have great, we've heard from today from leaders from companies like L3Harris. We have a great presence here from General Dynamics and Raytheon and BAE, many of the primes in the defense industry. But I think the big question for you today is, how do we grow innovation in a place like Fort Wayne, Indiana? How do we lure investment and create the jobs of the future, making the national defense technologies of the future, and do it right here in Fort Wayne, Indiana?
Well, Jim, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. You guys have a bunch of my favorite leaders in this country, not least yourself and Mitch Daniels and President Mung, who I met you saw earlier today. You know, my father actually got his master's degree at Purdue in engineering, chemical engineering, and he went to Harvard afterwards, and he always told everyone who listened that the people at Purdue were a lot smarter and more fun for him to work with than the guys out east there.
I went to IU. So it's true.
Well, big fan of the state and of Purdue, where we're at now as well. Listen, I think I started off my career building in Silicon Valley and was one of the only defense companies at the time, obviously, when we started it 21 years ago. And we'd always kind of complain about things being broken at the primes. Obviously, there's still a lot of amazing talent at the primes. They're a key part of the innovation system in America. There's a lot of great talent here that goes and works with them. So I think it's a little bit silly to attack them too much. But at the same time, if we're going to deter our enemies, we're going to have the best and brightest working in here. We do need other companies to be able to break in and win. I think especially on the software side, there's been a really big brain drain from a lot of large companies, large institutions in America, and the things that are possible to do in software that you want to combine with hardware, really require a lot of new talent. And so I think it's very healthy for America that we're building new companies and figuring out how to build new companies, and that's something we're excited to do here in Indiana with the talent as well.
You're the founder and the managing partner of 8VC, which is an early stage venture capital fund, over $6 billion in investment. And I think the question here, I know Mark Wickersham from Huntington County, we have John Urbans from Fort Wayne with Greater Fort Wayne. We have economic development officials here that are wondering, how do we lure that here? How do we bring that type of investment to
you already have a little bit of our money, not least through Anduril, where I backed Palmer Luckey in both of his companies early on, and he's buying things here and hiring people here. So I've probably put over $100 million into his company, and some of that's paying people right now in Indiana. So already by having companies like that partner here and bring Palmer here, you guys have done a great job with that. I think more places like Purdue doing what they're doing with this kind of talent, and more governors and people running the state who are going to cut red tape and make it easier to build here. A lot of manufacturing doesn't happen in America anymore. because it's so hard and so expensive to deal with a lot of the rules. And a lot of the raw materials, for example, and other kind of base manufacturing went to China and went other places. Sure, in part because there's cheaper labor there, but in part because we made it unnecessarily expensive here. And so there's a lot we can be doing politically still to bring people back.
You were a co-founder of Palantir. Maybe talk for a minute about what, for some people here who don't know what the important work is that Palantir does, but can you talk about the challenges of starting a new defense company? It's not easy.
Yeah, so there's really been 3 new kind of defense primes that have been able to break in since the Cold War. And the first one was Palantir, and then SpaceX, which a lot of us define as a sort of defense prime because it does do a lot of things. It's critical for our national security. And then Palmer's Anduril, and they just raised $14 billion. And Palantir took a very long time to break in. You can kind of think of it as a software defense prime. And after, I'll just give briefly the background, is after 9/11, we were kind of watching the U.S. government spend huge amounts of money on software. And I had been at PayPal as a kid when I was at Stanford Computer Science, and a lot of the best talent from around the world came to Silicon Valley, right? So if you think, where did PayPal come from? For example, it was Elon Musk coming from South Africa and a lot of his smartest friends from all around the world. It was Peter Thiel and a lot of his smartest friends, and they merged their companies to form PayPal. And the biggest threat at PayPal, as an example, was the Chinese and Russian mafia were stealing all of our money. And so we had about 7 major competitors that all went bankrupt because it turns out that if you try to ask someone for too much information, they don't want to use your system. But if it's too open, the mafia figure out how to run stolen credit cards, other things through it, and steal your money. I think we're losing $7-8 million a month ourselves at some point. And we ended up having to build very sophisticated systems to kind of empower analysts to figure out the fraud and to constantly stay ahead of the bad guys. It was a cat and mouse game where they'd find new ways and we'd find new ways. No time to go into it all here. But we were able to cut down the fraud enough to make the company profitable, and we sold to eBay. And it was a successful company. So having done that, we learned a lot about what's possible in the years 1999, 2000, 2001 for kind of analysis and bringing data together and investigations with data. And so being the very best in the world at that, and then seeing the U.S. government do things that were clearly 10 or 20 years behind for their analysis systems was very frustrating. And frankly, it was very scary after 9/11, both from the perspective of let's make sure we get the bad guys, but also from the perspective of violating civil liberties. And so Palantir was created as a kind of software prime to go in and solve these problems. So we ended up saving the government huge amounts of money, helped them stop thousands of attacks. We're really proud of the work the company's done.
Was the Pentagon helpful?
The government, it's really interesting. When most companies, in my experience, will have like very similar levels of talent. So if you go into like a Silicon Valley, like top high growth company, you're going to be surrounded by superstars. And if you go into maybe like certain types of medical billing companies in a suburb that have been around for 50 years, maybe they're not working that hard. Maybe it's a 94 kind of slow culture that's not super intense, and not to generalize. But what's interesting about the government is you'll have some just amazing mission-driven superstars who are just the best and brightest, and they'll be surrounded sometimes by people who are inept, have lost their mojo, who they're not allowed to be fired. And it's very frustrating because you got to like find those superstars and partner with them in order to get anything done. So we're able to do that, but it's a lot harder.
Well, talk about that. Talk about the bureaucracy at the Pentagon, though. I mean, obviously it limits innovation. It prevents the type of innovation that we need to compete with China and our other adversaries.
If I may, I think this is a broader problem in all of government, and I think the Pentagon is just one example of a culture that you see throughout D.C. So of course you've had about 60,000 more civilians join the Pentagon over the last decade, and I think the important framework here is the Pendleton Act was in 1883. So after the Civil War, the government got a lot bigger. We had new departments, Department of Agriculture, all these departments. And everyone said, wait a second, we're hiring tens of thousands of people and we're just hiring all of our friends. This is probably pretty broken. Let's try to make them competent. And so we actually did a kind of bipartisan thing at the time, said let's have hard tests to pass where you can't run things in different departments unless you score really highly on these tests. And we made them really hard. There's very much a merit-driven thing. And so when we were going to the moon as a country in the mid-20th century, that was being run by people who were really competent, had to pass really hard tests, and if they weren't doing well, they'd be fired. And what happened is you fast forward, these tests were around for about 100 years, and you get to the late 70s, and you got these activist judges, and they said, wait a second, look at who's passing a test. There's different results for different races. That's not fair. There's certain races that aren't doing as well on these tests. That's disparate impact. Let's get rid of these tests. and they're not allowed. So they got rid of the test, and at the same time, they put all the civil service reform where you couldn't fire anyone anymore. And so for 45 years, and I apologize because there are still smart people in the government, but for 45 years, our government hasn't been able to hire people based on how smart they are, and hasn't been able to fire them for being inept. What do you think's happened the last 45 years? It's a mess.
So you co-founded Palantir. Then you helped Palmer Luckey start Anduril. And I wonder if you could talk about artificial intelligence, but from a perspective of what is China doing on that front, and why is Anduril so important to our future of defense?
Sure, yeah. So I was lucky after Palantir to help build some other companies, and I backed Palmer at Oculus originally. If you remember that, it was a VR company, and he went to Facebook, and I think he got kind of kicked out for politically being on the other side of Facebook, and a lot of people wrote him off, and so it was really cool to back him. And he started Anduril with 3 of my former Palantir colleagues, and the reason I think these people got back in the harbor side of defense and really got involved is we got really scared, frankly, when we saw what was going on in China. So China, we used to always criticize them as only copying things. That was no longer true as of about 15 years ago. You really had a dynamic tech sector in Beijing. And a lot of us, I'll include myself on this list, were naive. If you go back in time 15 years, we thought China was going to emerge and become more free because we knew personally dozens or hundreds of leaders building great companies in China. A lot of them had read Milton Friedman, had read the principles of the U.S. When we talked to them, they believe in freedom, and they believe that's the direction China was going. So it became kind of a thing where we were really close to a lot of these guys and met a lot of them. And then you saw Xi Jinping come to power, and he started cracking down. Some of them disappeared. Even in the last couple of years, more of them disappeared, of course. But we really started seeing that started to happen, and we realized, wait a second, China's not going the right direction. The Chinese Communist Party is actually going to still stay in power. And not only that, they started making a lot of our friends help them with their defense stuff. Because your job when you're a venture capitalist and you're helping build a lot of companies is to follow talent. And so just like we follow talent here, we started to meet some of the talent there, and a lot of them were being forced to work on defense, and at the same time, we had followed the top 5,000, this is approximate, you can't measure it exactly, but the top thousands of software engineers in the US, and pretty much none of them were going into defense, other than Palantir at the time. And none of them were going. When they did go to the primes, they'd leave pretty quickly because unfortunately the cultures are not software cultures. When they did go into, it used to be NSA, 40 years ago, was way ahead of everything else, way ahead. I grew up as a computer scientist learning about how NSA had done things in the 70s that no one in academia could even explain why until 15 years later. So I had this pride in America, like we're so far ahead, we're the smartest, we're the best. That is no longer the case right now. NSA is recruiting from not the top places and not getting the best people, so this is terrifying to us. We say, wait a second, we have a very dangerous world, and then the defense primes are not keeping up with the type of talent that China is doing. We have to get back involved here as patriots. And so Palmer started Anduril with those guys, and a few of my friends and I started a couple other companies, Epirus and Saronic, that are also now what are called unicorns, billion-dollar companies, trying to improve the state of the art in key areas between software and hardware that we thought were critical for our country.
Can you talk about some of the other? What are some of the other really interesting companies that you're investing in?
So Anduril is doing a bunch of different stuff to compete with the primes directly. Epirus is as well, but especially in the HPM area. So what we realized, Epirus was the name of the bow of Theseus. Theseus is the founder of Athens, and in legend, his bow had infinite arrows. And so this is an electromagnetic pulse company. So it turns out that the new chips in Silicon Valley can control power on such small timescales that you can actually get all the power to hit the emitter at once, and you could fire about 10 times farther than the other companies were. So, the big primes don't necessarily love it when new companies break into the competitions, and so they try to, I think, stop competitions. And so, but the small companies, when we try to lobby for more open competition. Let us come in, let us prove it, let's make this fair. And so they kept us out of competitions for a while, but we finally got them to let us to this desert competition with the Army, and we had a certain size, certain power, and there's these hardened drones flying at it. And Epirus shot down the hardened drones 9.5 times farther away than any of the other companies. It's now being forward deployed by Central Command. So, drone warfare, of course, is extremely important. So being able to take out swarms of drones from a great distance, actually destroying the circuitry with the microwave radiation, is a pretty cool thing. So that's really fun. You can look it up. We have all sorts of fun things online and what it does. And it's going to change warfare in my mind because the distance is getting farther and farther. So that's key. Another one that's key in my mind is this company called Saronic. It was founded with us by a former Navy SEAL. And this one is really important to me and I think to all of us, because the Navy right now, it used to be in World War II, that whenever they destroy one of our ships, we'd build 2 or 3 more, and we have by far the biggest industrial base in the world. And that's, I think, a big way of how we dominated the seas in World War II. We actually didn't have the best ships. I think Germany, if you look at it, probably had some of the very best ships, but we had so many more that we crushed them. And unfortunately, it's the opposite now. China today, from my understanding, has about 200 times the shipbuilding capacity of the U.S. And this should be terrifying to all of us. This is unacceptable, frankly, for any kind of conflict there. And so we said, what do we do? And so we decided to teach the Navy how to use AI and how to manufacture huge numbers of smaller autonomous vessels. And so rather than, and I still think, by the way, big ships are important too, but the idea is you can complement the fleet with every big ship having 20 or 30 smaller ships, 6 feet long, 17 feet long, 27 feet long. We're weaponizing these with Anduril, with others, with the primes as well, with different types of torpedoes, different types of ways of confronting, and then we're building the AI, and we're kind of teaching the Pentagon and teaching Congress, here's how with 50 ships, with 300 ships, you do command and control, and you'd fight a battle, and here's how the different algorithms can do different types of missions, and we designed it with the SEALs, with the admirals, and it's exciting. We're ramping up. We're going to be doing 50 ships a month by early next year, and so we're starting to kind of hopefully rebuild the industrial base here for America.
It's great. You say you drove by the old fort.
I was awesome. There's you guys. I guess it's a fort. It's named after the fort.
Right.
When was that? It was like early 19th century or late 18th century.
Before. General Anthony Wayne, George Washington's favorite general, is the namesake of Fort Wayne.
Amazing.
And you can drive by. It's a replica. I'm sorry to give that secret away.
Is it a replica? Someone told me it was the original. Fort. They lied to me. It does look pretty cool.
The original location, or at least nearby, but. Fort Wayne is a great community, and we have a lot going for us. But I wonder if you have some examples of other communities like Fort Wayne that's developed an ecosystem for innovation that we could learn from.
Well, I think the key thing is having presence here, like with partnership with Purdue, as you guys have here, and then training people for that. Listen, I think this is one thing about defense that's really great is we do need to actually increase our manufacturing base. And the skills to do that are skills you can actually get pretty quickly and have really, really good jobs. And so what we have seen a lot of our companies, listen, it's learning to play the game, but it's a game that's good for America, which is you work with Congress and you figure out how to open your production facilities all around the country and to do it in a way that supports local communities. And we've seen this with a bunch of our companies opening up, and whether it's in Rhode Island, whether it's in Texas and Louisiana, and all sorts of states. And I think Indiana already has a really strong established base here, and obviously we're building out here as well. We'd love to do more here.
Loaded question, why are so many venture capital leaders fleeing California?
I wrote this obnoxious op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about this 5 years ago. Very proud to be raising our family in Texas, and we're fans of the state as well. Listen, it's about half of what we do is still in the San Francisco Bay Area because it's the center of AI. But the leadership in California, as far as I'm concerned, has lost their minds. It got to the point where anyone who wasn't making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year had to drive an hour to come in to work with us. You'd hire somebody and their spouse would hate you because even if you're paying them $250, they're living like they're poor relative to where they came from because it got so expensive and they don't allow building. There's all sorts of stories of like you send your kid and they're yelling at the first graders because they think there's only 2 genders, and that's like so unacceptable that you need to be yelled at even though you're 6 years old. It's like comical how ridiculous the place has gotten culturally, and then it's just very anti-business in general. And then of course when you do have wins, and they want to extract 14% extra, so it's not really worth it.
Last question that I'll ask, but happy to answer, open it up to the audience. Winston and Adam, if you want to grab a microphone. You talked about going to the moon, and one thing that I've noticed over the last 4 years serving on the House Armed Services Committee is the hyper-focus of the Pentagon on DEI and woke issues. And I wonder if you can unpack that for us. Does the hyper-focus of DEI at the Pentagon help us get to Mars, let alone ever go back to the moon again?
I think, not to dwell on this part of it too much, but our society is obviously missing religion and missing some things to deeply believe in. And so you have some very bad ideas trying to pose as new forms of religion for people. And I think a good example the DEI strategy is that it was talked a lot about where this lady really was fighting to add the word equity to D&I in New York. In New York, when she was working for the governor, this was her main focus, and it turned out, I don't know if you saw, it came out a few days ago, that this lady was actually a communist spy. And I think that's the right way to think about it, that if you were a communist spy and you wanted to weaken our society as much as possible, you'd focus on frameworks that were anti-merit and that put things in place not based on being the best or being the most practical, but based on things that divide us, like identity politics and otherwise. I think in my experience, it's almost impossible to have an organization focused on merit and hitting its top things while working with identity politics. It goes to the thing we were talking about earlier with the Pendleton Act and with the merit-based tests. Like when you have merit-based tests, there is disparity in the results. Thomas Sowell, who's one of the great economists alive today, he was Milton Friedman's star student, and he's written a lot about this. Happens to be a black economist, and he shows every society in the world has cultures with huge disparity. And we have cultures and disparity in America, but there's cultures all around the world of different skin colors, different types of people, and there's always going to be huge disparity. And if you try to impose things with DEI, it's very dangerous and it's very scary to me.
So it doesn't help us shoot for the moon.
It does not help us get to the moon. It might help us starve to death like it did with the equitable farm arrangements in China, but let's not go there.
Well put. Any questions? Right here in the middle.
One question I was asked is, my name is Billy Mitchell. Just one question. I've listened to a number of good things of what our guys can do against the Russian and Chinese in terms of software equipment and so forth. How good are they in say the Russians taking on the Ukrainians and doing the same thing to them? Is their capabilities as good as ours?
So, in my experience, the very best software engineers in the world are in the U.S., but most of them are not working with the DoD and the U.S. military. And so Palantir, by the way, when we built that company, was ranked number one. We tied with Facebook. My biggest competitor was my friend Adam D'Angelo, who worked for Zuckerberg as a CTO for talent. And so the reason Palantir was unique is that unlike almost everything else at the time, the reason we became a prime is because we were able to hire the best and brightest. The culture of what makes a great engineering culture is something that's so poorly understood by our government and by DoD, and especially on the software side, that their cultures, I would say, are behind the Chinese. I think the Chinese government understands better than our government what a great technology software culture looks like. But fortunately, we do have our free market industry, which is ahead. It has attracted the best and brightest. And so yes, I think they're very, very good. It's a very close competition. If we can bring the best in our market to partner with the DoD, which is what we're trying to do, I think we'll stay ahead of them.
Anybody else?
Could you comment on the role of public perception? I know Palantir's faced this with AI and how that's perceived with autonomy and robotics. How big of a challenge is that to you on a day-to-day basis?
The public perception of AI being a challenge because people are scared of it. Yeah, I don't think that's a day-to-day challenge so much as it is an existential challenge if they're able to trick the senators into passing something that sounds like good regulation that actually kind of cuts us off and gives power to the regulators to break us. And so what's interesting about Palantir also is that it's an AI software company now, because of course the things they do with data, you can apply AI on top of it. It works very well. And we have well over $1 billion revenue in the commercial space. And so Palantir is able to apply that and to work and create a lot of value in actual things in the other parts of the real world, which I think gives it a lot of credibility. And I would be most scared in general in Silicon Valley right now of, there's laws in Sacramento they're thinking of putting in place that I'm very strongly against. And a lot of people are hoping to use regulatory capture in Washington, D.C. to scare people. Like the fear doesn't really hurt us at all. What hurts us is that fear becomes a stupid law. And so we're relying on our great leaders here to hopefully stop that from happening.
One more question. Then I'll ask the last question. What further advice do you have for us to build upon what we already have going on here to create an ecosystem that will create more good jobs for Hoosiers for a long time to come?
Well, I think what's going to create more good jobs and lead to more flourishing is a DoD that cuts back on the bureaucracy, cuts back on the civilian control, and frankly is empowered by Congress to take risks and to make more choices with the right incentives. Right now, like you have to learn if you can go faster. Right now, like you've probably seen the graphs, it's slower and slower and slower every time we do a new system. And that's because it's more and more and more top down. We're still using the old model. Like when we built the procurement models in the 60s and 70s, the economists writing our textbooks and a lot of people in DC, they thought the Soviets were going to win. Like all the textbooks 60 years ago show the Soviet economy getting much bigger than the US economy. We know now that that's true. That's not our values. Our values are not top down. It's not bureaucracy. It's not that the world should be run and specified in 700-page documents. The way it works better is to give people money, put them in charge, tell them the direction to go, but let them make decisions. And if they succeed, to reward them, and if they fail, replace them. And unfortunately, no one gets fired anymore in the DoD, and no one's given responsibility in general in these things. And so I think if you want to have America thrive in this area, learn how to give people more freedom and responsibility, and learn how to reward them, learn how to fire them. And that would lead to a lot more flourishing, in my view.
Very well put. Thank you for coming to Fort Wayne. Thank you to all of you. Joe, that sounds like a charge for me to go back and be a leader on the NDAA to cut back on some of the bureaucracy and spur that kind of disruption that we need at that level. So thank you again for coming. This has been a great day. We've enjoyed the conversations. I hope all of you benefited from it, maybe made some new friends or some connections that will go a long ways to help us continue to make Northeast Indiana the very best that we can be. Thank you. God bless. Have a great day.